I'm Gerard Collins. I am one of the resident archivists. I'm housed at CSU Dominguez Hills, and I am actually going to share my screen real quickly here.
I'll introduce myself too. I'm Aza. I am the resident archivist at USC. I work in the digital library. And Crystal Johnson is resident archivist at Cal State Northridge at the University Library there.
So we're going to start with a quick review about what the residency is, for those of you who might not be familiar with it or haven't heard about it already. In 2018, LA Subject received a grant from the Institute of Museum and Library Services, IMLS, to fund a 2-year postgraduate opportunity for 3 recent MLIS grads to gain on-the-job archivist experience by working with different archive collections in the LA area, specifically those who are interested in digitizing collections. And the 3 of us have been in residence at the 3 hub institutions, CSUDH, CSUN, and USC since May of 2019. And in that time, we've worked closely with close to almost 30 member sites to develop their plans for digitization. And so what is the Capstone Project? The grant specifies that we need to complete a capstone, something of a summing up of our experience over the last 2 years, but it doesn't specify what it should be about or how it should be structured. We've talked about it a lot from the beginning, discussing it amongst the 3 of us, as well as with the other members of the residency project. And our first thought was to do a straight digitization toolkit, a step-by-step guide on how to digitize a collection. The problem we ran up against is that a lot of those already exist. We realized that if we did another one, it also wouldn't be comprehensive. We couldn't really address every possible scenario where a collection was going to be digitized. Plus, we'd really just be cribbing from those other resources because a lot of them are using the same standards at their root. And adding one more version would just add to the confusion that someone coming at this for the first time would face. And we also really wanted to draw on the experiences of the sites that we have been working with and to create something more bespoke and less generic. So rather than say, do this, we wanted to explain how we decided to do what we did and why based on the needs, wants, and intended usage of the member sites. We decided we could do this by exploring the life cycle of a digitization project, something you would find in a digital toolkit, but pair it with illustrative case studies that might help others who are contemplating doing something similar to understand the reasoning, rationales, calculations, and trade-offs that go into that decision-making process.
And after considering a few options for where we would host this capstone project and what would be the most, what would make the most sense, we settled on Scalar, which is a free and open source platform. And we decided on that as a project platform. Scalar was also used for the When I Think of Home virtual exhibit presented at last year's Archives Bazaar, so some of you may find the platform familiar. And so we've organized this capstone project into 3 main sections. We have the introduction and the main table of contents, and then the digital project section, which will be the main body where most of the content will be, and the resources section. The digital project section is divided into 4 sections: planning, digitization, metadata, and access. And this is where you'll find different case studies describing our collaborations with partner archives and organizations. We wanted each section to include a few examples of how the different phases in the life cycle of a digital project were represented in each of our collaborations. And the examples we use are by no means comprehensive of a digital project's life cycle, but we hope that by sharing our process, we can shed light on what is otherwise a pretty nebulous and complicated endeavor. Next slide.
Yeah, so this is still a work in progress, but we wanted to talk about the sections and the stages and the phases of the life cycle and sort of what we are putting in each of those. So the first section is planning, which might be the most useful and applicable as it will be comprised of the things that need to be thought of before undertaking a project. So a lot of this will be applicable whether an institution or an organization decides to do it on their own sort of DIY style, or if they opt to use a vendor. So things like collection inventory and assessments, considering physical accessibility, how easy it is to retrieve and handle the material during digitization, arrangement and description of collections before any sort of, say, scanning begins, but also the questions about the hardware, software, time, space, and staff requirements that will be necessary before undertaking any project. It's also a chance to think about those fundamental questions about, what do you want to digitize and why, who's going to use it, how are they going to use it, who's going to digitize it and how are they going to do that, and when does it need to be done by, and ultimately, where is it going to live? Spoiler on that last one, a thumb drive and a desk drawer is not going to be the best answer. So a lot of considerations before jumping in and scanning things. And on the left, you can see some of the sites that we've picked whose collections and experiences we thought would be particularly good examples of how this part of the process was addressed. And this whole life cycle isn't a strictly a linear process either. The hope is that once the site is up and Scalar will allow users to jump around and look at different areas and see how everything is connected. There's something of a logical progression, but each of these phases feed off of and into the others. So it's not like we did all of our planning as step one, then moved on to digitization as step two, then completed it, moved on to step three, metadata. Each section sort of touches on the other because you'll be making decisions that are informed by the things in those sections. So planning informs execution, and the things learned during execution can affect the plan. And then there are also the unexpected events like global pandemics that severely limit your ability to access equipment and collections and cut you off from other people. So when something like that happens, it's always going to require a reevaluation of what's feasible right now. But after thinking about things a bit, we can also move on to digitization. This is a section that's going to most resemble a typical digitization toolkit. As I said earlier, we aren't going to have the time to do a comprehensive guide for every possible medium and every possible scenario, although we will talk about the resource section in a bit that might help with what we don't cover. But we are going to hit on some of the more common ones like photos, documents, scrapbooks, and discuss the technical specifications that we set for some of the sites, which standards were consulted and why those were selected, as well as how workflows and quality control procedures are established. Some of the sites were really straightforward in their implementation, and some were outliers where compromises had to be made, or allowances had to be afforded. Each project is different with different needs and intended audiences, and there's always a trade-off for cost and storage space and the time available for a project. So the goal for this section is for the case studies to illustrate what went into those decisions. The sites listed on the left are ones, again, that we thought made for interesting examples in the process. But just having a bunch of digital files isn't enough for a useful and usable digital archive project. There's also metadata.
So with archival collections, both digital and analog, metadata is essential to ensuring materials are discoverable by users. So, and by the people within the archive who work there, volunteers, what have you. So what exactly is metadata? It's most simply described and defined as data about data. It's like the actual definition of it. But if we consider every object in our collections as data, then the metadata, such as the name, the origin, who created it, and the physical description of the item, like size, condition, it tells the very beginning of each object's story. So digitizing collections takes a lot of effort, as Gerard has described, especially in the planning phase as well. And no digital project is exactly the same as another. What many people, including myself before this residency program, don't realize is that metadata takes just as much time and labor as creating digital surrogates and should be calculated into a project's timeline and budget accordingly. But what this section will address is some of the approaches to metadata creation we practiced in our digital projects, including metadata co-creation, where the collaborators and the resident archivists create metadata for the collection together. Implementing archival standards. We use Dublin Core standards at all three of our hub institutions. It's really the most accessible in terms of like someone coming at it from the first time, and customizable metadata standard. And like I mentioned, it's widely used in a lot of academic institutions where collections are aggregated from. The third topic will be creating local vocabularies. that are more aligned with collecting institutions and the genre of materials they have, such as the graphic art slides at the Carita Art Center. Next slide, please. Thank you. And like Sherrod mentioned, this is not really a linear process, but there is some sort of linearity as to like when each step comes in during a digital project. So once the planning process for a digital project has been completed, materials have been digitized or reformatted, and the digital materials are enriched with metadata, the next step is making collections accessible. So speaking broadly, this section will be about a user's ability to view and engage with digitized materials online, as well as efforts to make collections accessible long-term. This can span from captioning and transcribing audiovisual materials, such as Crystal's been working on with the Tom and Ethel Bradley Center at CSUN, to making collections accessible to users with disabilities. To make collections accessible to users with disabilities, and to drafting a preservation plan, like Sherrod has been working on with the Center for the Study of Political Graphics to ensure the longevity of access to a digital collection. In some cases, digitized materials may need to be reformatted in order to even be uploaded into a digital library for people to engage with, such as with the Immaculate Heart community and their extensive oral histories. In describing these processes and demonstrating our efforts, we hope to shed some light on the complexity of digital projects and demystify some of the steps it takes to embark on a digital project, wherever you may find yourself along the life cycle. Next slide, please. And one of the features will be a resource page. So for that reason, in order to make this a little less overwhelming and nebulous, we'll be sharing resources as well as the process of working on these different projects. The resources will be ones we've created ourselves throughout the residency, and those that we found ourselves referencing more frequently. Throughout the past 2 years, a number of journal articles, texts, blog posts by practitioners have been tremendously useful in grounding our work. We'll be sharing open access content and referencing the rest for you to seek through your own channels. And there are a lot of useful guides, as Gerard has mentioned, and toolkits online that can be modified and adapted to various projects. So in addition to the resources we've created ourselves, we'll be sharing those that guided us along the way, where there were gaps, like for metadata creation, description, and digitization, and various aspects of creating a digital project in general. And these documents I found can be easily adapted and referenced when creating metadata guidelines or digitization plans for your own archive and your own projects. So I like to think of them as templates rather than just guides to follow on your own, because you can always customize them to your needs.
So an idea that had occurred to us actually early last year was that we would have some sort of in-person event this year, this spring, that would kind of bring some of these things to life. Getting representatives from the sites we work with to talk about their experiences and the reflections on the process, what they thought worked and what didn't. But like that occurred to us at the beginning of last year, and a lot has happened since then that maybe made that not seem like such a viable idea. But we haven't let it go completely. Thought it might be interesting to do it virtually rather than in person, and we would like to gauge what sort of interest people might have in some sort of virtual event. We're all zoomed out, I know. So we have set up a survey, not only to see if people would be interested, but if they are, what kind of content they'd like to see in order to make the thing worthwhile. We had a couple of suggestions of a round table with the archives who participated, or maybe a deeper dive into the project life cycles with the residents, or just a Q&A forum that people could maybe participate in, but also any other ideas that people may have where they think they might get some use out of sharing the capstone once we complete it. So like I said, the form is here. We'll put this in the chat as well if people want to participate. And as well, if we'd open up now to, if anybody has any questions now, be happy to answer them. Or we also have this laas.archivists@gmail.com. If thoughts occur to anybody later on, you can email us and we'd be happy to answer questions or take suggestions.
Thanks, Gerard. I put the link to the survey in the chat for the virtual exhibit, not virtual survey. And yeah, we'll be taking responses until April 30th. And if you have any questions or suggestions about the survey or about our project, yeah, get in touch with us through our email, which I will also put in the chat.